Houston locked up a share of the Big 12 regular season title, while Kansas narrowly avoided a disastrous loss in Boulder in Big Monday action.
You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, folks? Happy Tuesday, and welcome into the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, a daily national college hoops show, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I am your host, Andy Patton, here to recap some Big Monday action, get you ready for all the fun games going on tonight on Tuesday. You're joining us at the place to get your college basketball content every single day. I want to thank you all for making the show your first listen or your first watch of the day. Give a special shout out to those everyday listeners and remind you all that you can listen to this show ad-free on Amazon Music. Well, like I said, we got 4 games from Monday that we're going to recap here. We had the triple header on Big Monday. We also had a Big 10 game going on. We're going to talk about all those matchups. We also got some very exciting SEC matchups coming up tonight. 3 teams all vying for what will probably be 2, maybe just 1 of the number 1 seeds available, depending on if Houston climbs into that number 1 conversation. We'll talk about that. We also got a unique matchup between Duke and Miami tonight. We'll talk about why that is and some bubbly games to preview to get you on with your day. But let's start with the Big Monday action. We'll start with the ranked on ranked matchup. Number 4 Houston goes to Texas Tech. The number 10 Red Raiders gets a W, 69-61, the final score. And look, we'll talk Houston obviously here in a second, but big shout out to Texas Tech because they were the home team. Yes, they beat Houston on the road earlier this year, but they went into this game without 2 of their best players in sharpshooter Chance McMillian and Darian Williams. Neither of them were in this game. Again, 2 of their 3 or 4 best players on this roster. And Grant McCasland only played 6 players. So for Texas Tech to hang with a Houston team is an 8-point win, but it was close throughout. Texas Tech never really went away. To hang with one of the best teams in college basketball without 2 of your key starters. Kerwin Walton stepped up in a major way into a bigger role in this game. He had a nice game. He had a couple clutch shots down the stretch. Just a really solid performance from Texas Tech. But Milos Uzan was too much for the Red Raiders. He drops 22, a career high for Uzan. Not just career high in a Houston uniform, career high total for him. He had 8 of 15 from the field. He was 3 of 4 from beyond the arc and 3 of 4 from the free throw line. He broke his career high with 2 free throws with under 30 seconds to go. Really clutch shots for him down the stretch. Houston has now clinched at least a share of the Big 12 regular season title. They are now tied for 3rd all time in total regular season Big 12 conference titles. They're tied for 3rd all time. Folks, it's their 2nd year in the Big 12. They've only been in the Big 12 for 2 years. That is absolute insanity. It speaks to the dominance of a program like Kansas, who has won so many conference titles. It also speaks to how hard it is to win in this league and what Houston has done coming into this league under Coach Kelvin Sampson, just how incredible they have been. Cougars now 24-4 on the year, 16-1 in Big 12 conference play. And I think the big part of the conversation is what this does for their quest for a number 1 seed. Because we could continue to talk about Auburn and Duke pretty much locking up number 1 seeds at this point in the season. And then the rest of that conversation, Alabama's in that conversation, but then they've stumbled a little bit. Florida remains in that conversation. Tennessee is in that conversation. And look, all 3 of those SEC teams, they're in action tonight. They all have opportunities to boost their resume as number 1 seeds. But Houston, it's hard to ignore them. It's really hard to ignore this Houston team. They've lost once since November. Like, this team has been just absolutely incredible this season. Again, 16-1 in the Big 12. Yeah, the Big 12 is maybe a little bit down from where it's been in the past, but this is still a really good basketball conference, and they've just run through it like butter. It has been incredible to watch what Kelvin Sampson's club has done. Meanwhile, Texas Tech, they fall to 21-7, 12-5 in the Big 12, 3rd in the conference, half game behind Arizona. Next up for them, they're at Kansas. Then they host Colorado at home. Then they're at Arizona State. So you definitely got to get those back too. If you get Colorado at Arizona State, you should get Kansas at Fog Allen. If you do that for Texas Tech, I think you're in that 2-seed conversation. If you're not able to win that one at Kansas, you're probably closer to that 3-seed conversation. Of course, it depends what happens in the Big 12 tournament as well. Speaking of Kansas, they survived at Colorado. The Buffs 0-13 to start Big 12 play. They've won 2 of their last 3 games coming into this contest, and they gave Kansas everything that they had. Kansas had a 5-point lead at halftime. Colorado erased that, held Kansas scoreless for the first 3.5 minutes. I say Colorado held them scoreless. Kansas, I think, also missed their first 5 free throws of the second half in this game. Really felt like they were doing everything they could to make this a contest, but Colorado just didn't quite have the horses to be able to pull off the upset here. Kansas was 9 of 19 from the free throw line in the second half. They had 2 turnovers in the first half and then 3 turnovers in the first 75 seconds of the second half. They shot 3 of 13 from 3. They got out-rebounded by Colorado by 15, 46-31. The Buffs had 18 offensive rebounds. 18 offensive rebounds for Colorado. Yet, Hunter Dickinson willed this Kansas team to a victory. 32 points for him, 13 rebounds. He was 13 of 18 from the field. It was his highest scoring game in Dickinson's career in a Kansas uniform, his 5th 30-point, 10-rebound game of his career. Without Dickinson doing what he did, Kansas for sure loses this basketball game. Instead, they moved to 19-9 overall, 10-7 in the Big 12. Next up for them, they're hosting Texas Tech, like we said. Then they're at Houston, and then they're hosting Arizona. A brutal 3-game finisher for Kansas. We'll see if they can use what I guess we'll call as momentum from this win over Colorado. And of course, their win over Oklahoma State previously into potentially some success to finish out the regular season. Meanwhile, Colorado, they're at Kansas State next, at Texas Tech, and then hosting TCU to close it out for them. Other big Monday games to get to. North Carolina takes down Florida State, the Noles, 96-85, 4th straight win for a Tar Heels team that started to finally come around. It took them a long, long time to start to look like a team capable of contending for a spot in the NCAA tournament. They just flat out didn't look that good for most of December, most of January, but they started to come around lately. RJ Davis, 20 points for him in this one. He was 5 of 9 from the field, 3 of 5 from deep. Seth Trimble had 17 off the bench. North Carolina now a half game out of 4th place in the ACC behind Wake Forest and SMU, and they really needed this one. Lenardi on Friday for his bracketology report had them as one of the first 4 out for North Carolina. I think the expectation all along has been win every single one of your remaining ACC games until you're playing Duke. If you lose to Duke at Cameron, it's okay, but you got to win every other game. So far, so good for North Carolina, who takes down Florida State. They've got Miami next. Then they're at Virginia Tech. Then it's that Duke game. There is no reality where North Carolina, outside of a ACC tournament championship, makes the NCAA tournament if they lose to Virginia Tech or Miami. I don't want to say no reason. I should take that back, but very little chance of making the big dance if you lose either of those games. Miami and Virginia Tech are terrible. You got to win those 2 games. The Duke game would really help if you won it. But at least win those other 2 games. Keep that momentum going into that game against Duke. Next up, Michigan wins at Nebraska in a game that was looked like a basketball score from like the 50s or 60s. Maybe I saw somebody say it looked like an Iowa football game score. Michigan won at Nebraska 49-46 was the final score. Both teams shot under 30% from the field. Both teams shot under 22% from 3. Both teams shot under 67% from the free throw line. It was just an ugly, ugly, ugly basketball game going on at the Cornhuskers. And yet Michigan still finds a way to get a W here. They are now tied with Michigan State, 13-3 in the Big Ten. As it currently stands, Michigan State, of course, has that tiebreaker, having beat Michigan in their first head-to-head matchup. But those 2 teams playing each other again in a couple of weeks. Danny Wolf had a double-double, 10-10 in this game. Vlad Golden, 8-10. Michigan next up, they got Rutgers and Illinois and Maryland all at home. So a nice little home stretch for them before that road game against Michigan State to close out conference play. Nebraska was a bubble team coming into this game. They were the last 4 by per Lenardi again on his Friday bracketology report. This would have been the most impressive win of the season for Fred Hoiberg and the Cornhuskers, but they were not able to pull it off. Now they've lost 2 of their last 3 games, including losing at Penn State by 17. That loss is really going to hurt them. This Michigan loss, not crushing for them, but really would have been nice to have a feather in the cap of their resume. Bryce Williams had 26 of Nebraska's 46 points. In the first half, I could not believe it when I saw this. Bryce Williams had 18 of Nebraska's 21 points. 18 of their 21 points. I think they'd only made 1 other field goal outside of Bryce Williams in the first half of this game. In fact, Williams was 4 of 9 from 3. Sam Hoiberg off the bench was 2 of 2 from 3. The rest of the team, not named Bryce Williams and Sam Hoiberg, 0 of 17. Not going to win a whole lot of basketball games shooting like that from beyond the arc for Coach Hoiberg's club. Next up for them, they play Minnesota at home, at Ohio State and Iowa. It's not a great trio of games, which makes them winnable for Nebraska, but it also means there's not a lot of wiggle room for them as a team that's kind of right on the bubble right now. I think you need to win all 3 of these. I think you can maybe get away with losing the road game to Ohio State, but you got to beat Iowa. You got to beat Minnesota if you want to stay on the right side of the bubble for the Cornhuskers. Well, folks, 3 SEC teams are battling tonight to join Auburn and Duke on the number 1 seed line. We're going to preview those games and more coming up here in just a second. But first, folks, March basketball is almost here, and there's no better way to get in on the action than PrizePicks, the best place for daily fantasy sports. With PrizePicks, you pick more or less on at least 2 player stat projections, and if you're right, you can win up to 1,000 times your cash. It's fast, it's easy, and it keeps every game exciting. PrizePicks even offers weekly promos like Taco Tuesday, where you get discounted player projections for even more value. PrizePicks has lines for Luka facing Dallas, 30.5 points for Luka, LeBron 24.5 points in that Lakers-Dallas matchup. So download the app today and use code LOCKEDONCollege to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. That's code LOCKEDONCollege for $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. PrizePicks, run your game. All right, folks, segment 2, still Andy Patton, still Locked On College Basketball Podcast. And we're moving away from recapping Big Monday action to talk about all of the great games taking place on Tuesday. We got tons of games to cover. I think 17 total between these final 2 segments. We'll start with a quintet of games in the SEC. 1 ranked on ranked. That's Mississippi State at Alabama. The rest are all a variety of different games. We've got 2 teams that are vying for those number 1 overall seeds playing against unranked teams on the road. We'll start with Florida. 3rd-ranked Gators going at Georgia. That's also a bubble game, as Lenardi has Georgia among the first 4 out. This game, 7 Eastern time on the SEC Network. FanDuel currently favors the Gators by 7.5. Florida's 24-3. All 3 of their losses have come in the SEC. Left for the Gators after this game, they host Texas A&M. They're at Alabama. They host Ole Miss. They need a win to stay on track. You cannot lose this game to Georgia to stay in the conversation as a number 1, or to stay in a 1 seed spot. You'll still be in the conversation, but you'll be on the outside looking in if you lose this game to Georgia. Not that Georgia's a bad team. You just, the margin of error at this point is very, very thin for anybody trying to compete for one of those number 1 seeds. Meanwhile, for Georgia, they're currently on a 4-game losing streak. They're down to 4-10 in the SEC. I know this team's listed on the bubble. I know Lenardi has them on the wrong side of the bubble at this point, but it's kind of hard for me to imagine. I mean, they're 2-9 in their last 11 games. Kind of hard for me to see this Georgia team doing enough in the final closing stretch here to get into the NCAA tournament again. 2-9 in their last 11 games. Their wins were South Carolina and LSU. Neither team that's even going to sniff the NCAA tournament. Now, for Georgia, not only do they have this huge home game against Florida, but they also play at Texas, they play at South Carolina, and then they host Vanderbilt. If you lose this game to Florida, you need all 3 of the rest of these. You beat Texas, that's at least a bubble team. You beat South Carolina, that's a no-brainer. You got to do it. You beat Vandy, that's another bubble / in the field team. If you win those games, maybe you start to have that conversation with Georgia. But for right now, I think they're on the outside looking in. Next up, Tennessee on the road at LSU, 5th-ranked Vols, 9 Eastern time on the SEC Network. FanDuel favoring the Vols here by 10.5. Tennessee 22-5 on the season, 9-5 in the conference. After this game, they host Bama. They're at Ole Miss. They host South Carolina. They need this one to stay in that number 1 seed conversation. Pretty much the same situation that Florida's currently in. You can't lose a game to a team like Georgia. You can't lose a game to a team like LSU, even if they're at home. Even if you're the road team, you just can't do it. These 2 teams need to pick these ones up. For LSU, they started conference play 1-10, but they did win 2 in a row before losing to Florida. Still, LSU very far outside of that picture at this point. Ranked on ranked, 24 Mississippi State going to Tuscaloosa to take on number 6 Alabama, the Crimson Tide. 9 Eastern time on ESPN2, FanDuel favoring those Tide by 8.5 points. Bama's 1-2 in their last 3 games. Have been in that 1 seed conversation like we've been saying, but have kind of fallen out after losing 2 of their last 3. They lost to Auburn, not a big deal for a resume perspective, big deal for the fan base, don't get me wrong, but not huge from the resume perspective. But then they lost at Missouri, also not a terrible loss, but not a great loss for Alabama. They were favored in that one. And they beat Kentucky. Next up for them, they're at Tennessee, then they host Florida, then they're at Auburn. That is a brutal finishing stretch for Alabama, not saying nothing about the fact that this Mississippi State team is not going to be an easy one either. This is a really rough stretch for Bama. 2-2 in this stretch would be pretty good, but would it be enough to keep them on the 1 seed line? It kind of depends. If you lose to Tennessee, Tennessee might sneak into that conversation. If you lose to Florida, they might sneak into that conversation. Like you're literally facing 3 teams that are all either competing for number 1 seeds or in Auburn's case, pretty much already have it locked up. Rough stuff. That's what makes the SEC so dang difficult this year, is that you don't have a lot of nights off. Meanwhile, the Bulldogs, they fell to 7-7 in the SEC with that loss at Oklahoma, but they do have some nice wins. They swept Ole Miss this year. They beat Texas A&M. They're finishing at a relatively easy slate comparatively to the SEC, at least. They host LSU, they host Texas, then they're at Arkansas to finish it out. Would be a real possibility for them. Certainly if they go beat Bama on the road, that's a huge win. But even if they don't, if they win these final 3, puts them in a good spot to earn a solid seed going into March. Final SEC game, South Carolina going on the road at Missouri, 14th ranked Tigers, 9 Eastern time on ESPNU, FanDuel favoring Mizzou by 13.5. This is a must-win game for Missouri. Obviously, South Carolina would be a devastating loss for them. They got 2 road games after this, at Vandy, at Oklahoma, then they host Kentucky. If Mizzou could reasonably go 4-0 in this stretch, would really put them in a conversation as a potential top 10 team, potential maybe not 3 seed, maybe 4 seed conversation. I think right now they're kind of in that 5-6 seed range, but this is the kind of game that Mizzou's totally expected to win, absolutely should win, but it's really, really devastating for them from a seeding perspective if they don't. South Carolina, by the way, 1-8 on the road this year. Their last time, the only time they've beaten a team on the road, was December 3rd when they beat Boston College. So this is not a team that plays very well on the road. Should work out well for Dennis Gates' team. A couple games to talk about in the Big 12 before we move on and talk about Duke, Miami, and some other fun games going on tonight. Number 9, Iowa State on the road at Oklahoma State, 8 Eastern time. This game on ESPN+. FanDuel favoring the Cyclones in this one by 10.5. Cyclones up to 21-6. They won 4 of their last 5. They stumbled for a while without Milan Momcilovic, but he is back now. They're back cruising. Next up for them after this Oklahoma State game is they got Arizona and BYU at home, and then they're on the road at Kansas State. For Iowa State, you can't look ahead. You can't get too excited about Arizona, BYU. You got to make sure you go take care of this Pokes team on the road before you get to those games to finish out the season. Baylor at Cincinnati, not quite a bubble game. Baylor is listed as a 9 seed right now per Lenardi, but they have lost 2 in a row. The Arizona loss, not too devastating, but the Colorado loss, pretty darn bad. Like we said, Colorado was 1-14 before beating Baylor in that game. This is a Baylor team that's really struggled as of late. If they lose this game to Cincy, which is very possible, FanDuel favoring the Bearcats by 1.5 in this one. If they lose this game to Cincinnati, I think you're looking at Baylor being squarely on the bubble of the NCAA tournament. After that, they got Oklahoma State at home. You got to win that one. They're at TCU. They already lost to TCU once. If you take a season sweep to the Horned Frogs, that's really rough. And then they host Houston. You probably need 2 out of those 3. And I think you need the Cincy game. This Baylor team's in a little bit of a predicament at this point. And this Cincinnati game is very, very important. For Cincy, they're not really on the bubble right now. 6-10 in the Big 12 kind of puts you in a position where you're not really in that conversation. They also don't really have any great wins, but they did beat BYU. That's a decent win. They beat Xavier. That's an okay win. But for Cincy, you need the rest of your games. You need to beat Baylor here at home. You also need to beat Houston at Houston, which is a brutally difficult thing to do. Then you need to beat Kansas State at home. Then you need to beat Oklahoma State on the road. If you win 3 of those 4 and you lose the game at Houston, you still probably need to win a couple games in the Big 12 tournament, and then maybe you're in that conversation. But right now, they don't have a big enough resume to be in that mix. Last but not least, TCU going out to Morgantown to take on West Virginia, 9 Eastern time on the CBS Sports Network. FanDuel favoring the Mountaineers in this one by 6.5. Right now, Lenardi has West Virginia as a 10 seed. They've lost 3 of their last 4. The only win in that time was a 3-point win over Cincinnati. Left for them is that road trip out to Utah to take on BYU and Utah, and then hosting Central Florida. This is a West Virginia team that probably needs to go 3-1 out of these last 4. Maybe even 2-2, maybe 2-2 is good enough, but there's just not a lot of good losses to take here. If you lose at BYU, I think you feel okay about that, but your other loss is not going to be a good one. So for West Virginia to kind of hang on to a spot that's comfortably in the field instead of being in that bubble conversation, I think you probably need to go 3-1 the rest of the way. Meanwhile, TCU hasn't really been listed in the conversation yet, but they're 15-12. They're 8-8 in the Big 12. They beat Texas Tech. They beat Baylor. They beat BYU. They beat West Virginia. They beat Xavier. That's a pretty good slate of victories for Jamie Dixon and the Horned Frogs. After this game, after West Virginia, they got Central Florida, Baylor at home, and then at Colorado. I would not be stunned if TCU goes 4-0 to finish out the season. If that's the case and they're 12-8 in the Big 12, 19-12 overall, I think TCU is a tournament team. At least should be on the bubble at that point going into the Big 12 tournament. So this game, to me, not exactly a bubble game yet, but a game that I think has some significant bubble implications for both programs involved. Well, folks, Miami hosts Duke Tuesday night with associate head coach Jai Lucas reportedly taking over for the Canes. That should make an otherwise uninteresting game maybe a little bit more fun. We're going to talk about that and 8 other games to preview coming up in just a second. All right, folks, segment 3, still Andy Patton, still locked on college basketball, still previewing a ton of great games on Tuesday night for you. We talked the SEC games and the Big 12 games to watch. Now we're going to talk about some bubbly games, a few other ranked games, and some other stuff to check out on Tuesday as well. We'll start in the ACC where number 2 Duke going on the road to take on Miami, 7 Eastern time on ESPN. Duke favored at FanDuel by 22.5 points, but that's not the storyline in this game. The storyline is that reportedly, Duke associate head coach Jai Lucas has agreed to take the head coaching job at Miami, replacing Jim Larrañaga, who retired somewhat abruptly in December of this year. The latest reports that we're getting is that this is a deal that's effectively done, but they're still working on some contract negotiations, among them being when Lucas would start, because Duke is presumably going to play into late March, potentially early April. Whereas the transfer portal opens on March 24th, and Miami's season is going to end on March 8th, almost certainly. Miami probably wants a coach in before the start of the transfer portal period. Why wouldn't you? The fact that Coach L stepped down when he did, the fact that they already have a coach in mind means they want to get this thing going. They want to have a coach in the building, convincing players to stay on the roster and starting to work on finding players who are in the transfer portal. Coach Lucas can't do that if he's still on the sideline at Duke. This is not going to be a question that is resolved during this game on ESPN tonight. It's not. But I'm very interested what does happen, and I'm interested to see if there is conversation about it, what the broadcasters say about it. It's just going to kind of make this game that I think is otherwise going to be fairly dull, at least as dull as a Duke game can be. It's going to make it a little bit more interesting. Elsewhere in the ACC, number 19 Louisville at Virginia Tech, 9 Eastern time on the ACC network. FanDuel favoring the Cards by 10.5. Louisville's been dominant all season long, 21-6. 5 of their 6 losses have been to projected NCAA tournament teams, with the only other loss being at Georgia Tech. Left for Louisville after this game, they're at Virginia Tech. Then they got Pitt, Cal, and Stanford at home. They could finish 4-0. They could finish 25-6. This Virginia Tech team is very bad. I'm a little surprised FanDuel's only got the Cards by 10.5 in this one. But Louisville's in a great position to finish the season real strong under Pat Kelsey. And then we got Georgia Tech at Pitt. This is a bubble game, as Pitt listed in the next 4 out per Lenardi. 7 Eastern time on the ACC network. Pitt favored by 8.5 in this one. Panthers 7-9 in the ACC. They're bad. They have bad losses. Florida State lost bad. Virginia lost bad. Notre Dame, most recent loss, ugly. I'm not sure I see Pitt right now. They're hanging on by a thread. I think there's teams even below them in the next 4 out. I think there's teams that aren't listed at all on Lenardi's bracket that have a better resume and a more likely chance of making the tournament than Pitt. Their margin of error is razor thin. Home loss to Georgia Tech would be it. That'd be it. They'd be done. After that, they're at Louisville. You can maybe lose that one and still be in a good spot, but that's tough. They're at NC State. Can't lose that one. They host Boston College. Can't lose that one. You got to go 3-1. You probably need 4-0. And even then, I think you need 4-0 or 3-1, and you still got to be hoping you do some damage in the ACC tournament if you want to be dancing this March. 2 games in the Big Ten to talk about. Washington going on the road out to Madison to take on number 11 Wisconsin, 9 Eastern time on Peacock. FanDuel favoring the Badgers by 15.5. Wisconsin looking to get back in the win column after blowing a 17-point second-half lead and losing to Oregon. Really gross game for the Badgers. Thankfully, if you're looking for a rebound game, Washington's the team you want to be playing. The Huskies 4-12 in the the Big Ten. Their only good win on the season is hosting Maryland. They won that one. That was a nice one for them earlier in the year, but this is not a very good Huskies team. Wisconsin should take care of business, although the Badgers struggle a little bit with good bigs, and Great Osobor is pretty great for the Huskies, so keep an eye on that. Next up, Iowa at Illinois. This game didn't really fit. It's not a bubble game. It's not a ranked game because Illinois is not ranked right now, but I'm curious about this game. The Illini have now lost 3 in a row. They're down to 17-11 overall, just 9-8 in the Big Ten. This game, by the way, 9 Eastern time on FS1. FanDuel favoring the Illini by 9.5. After this game, Illinois at Michigan and then home at Purdue. So it's a rough finisher for the Illini. Iowa, meanwhile, 15-12, 6-10 in the Big Ten. They're at Northwestern, host Michigan State, and at Nebraska to close it out for the Hawkeyes. Some other games to talk about here to close out the show, some of them having bubble implications. First, we'll talk about the only other ranked team in action on Tuesday, Marquette, 21st ranked Golden Eagles hosting Providence at 7 Eastern time on FS1. FanDuel favoring Marquette by 12.5 in that one. Marquette at one point in the season was 18-3. They were 9-1 in the Big East, but they have lost 4 of their last 6 games, a big skid for this team in the last few weeks in conference play. Next up for them after hosting Providence is they are at Georgetown, then they're at UConn, and then they are hosting St. John's. That's a pretty tough finisher for Marquette as well. Even at Georgetown's not a super easy game. That's a long road trip for them. Ed Cooley's team has got some talent. Thomas Sorber's been very, very good. So Shaka's club, a bit of a skid right now, and they're not looking like they got an easy path to finish the regular season here. Providence 12-15, 6-10 in the Big East. All I really got to say about the Friars, looking back at the resume, they beat the crap out of BYU earlier this year. And while Providence's resume is nowhere close to the NCAA tournament, that win over BYU, 19-point win, has aged exceptionally well for the Friars. Next up in the A10, we got VCU at Richmond. VCU last 4 in per Joe Lunardi. It's kind of between VCU and George Mason to win the A10. Potential bid thief situation there with both those teams having NCAA tournament caliber resumes. This game at 7 Eastern time on the CBS Sports Network. FanDuel favors VCU by 14.5, and they should be. Not only are they 12-2 in the A10, but they played Richmond back on February 1st and beat them by more than 14.5 points. The spread's 14.5. Last time these two teams played, VCU won by 41 points. 90-49 was the final score. Obviously, this one's a road game for VCU, but they should take care of business against the Spiders. Move to 13-2, keep themselves in the bubble conversation. Moving over to the Mountain West, New Mexico going on the road to the Viejas Arena to take on San Diego State. 11 Eastern time on FS1, FanDuel favoring the Aztecs by 2.5 in this one. New Mexico is listed as a 9 seed per Joe Lunardi, while San Diego State is a last 4 bye. So this is a kind of a double bubble game. New Mexico is not on the bubble, and I don't know if they'll end up being on the bubble. I think Lunardi will continue to have them projected to be the automatic qualifier out of the Mountain West, and as they should be at this point, but Utah State's right in that mix as well, and we'll see what happens in the Mountain West tournament. But San Diego State, they need to win at home. It's not a critical game in the sense that you can stomach a loss to New Mexico, but it being a home game, you put a lot of pressure on the rest of your schedule. If you don't win this game, your next games are at Wyoming, at UNLV, and then home against Nevada. If you don't beat New Mexico, I think you got to go 3-0 in those games. I think unquestionably you're 3-0 in those games. If you're anything other than that, you're on the wrong side of the bubble, and now you're putting a lot of pressure on yourself in the conference tournament. New Mexico, again, not a bubble team. You want this game. A road loss to San Diego State is certainly not going to kill you, but you want this game. After this, they host Air Force. You got to win that one. They're at Nevada, and then they're hosting UNLV. So New Mexico is still in a comfortable position, but this would be a nice feather in the cap of their resume, would potentially put them in a very comfortable spot in the big dance, and would put San Diego State even further down in the bubble. Last but not least, also at 11 Eastern time, this game on the CBS Sports Network, Gonzaga going out to Santa Clara to take on the Broncos. FanDuel favoring the Zags by 6.5. Gonzaga lost to Santa Clara at home earlier this year, back in mid-January. It was the first time in decades that Gonzaga has lost a home game to Santa Clara. It was the first time in the history of the McCarthy Athletic Center that they have given up 100 points at home. It had never happened before. The Zags also lost this game last year on the road at Santa Clara. Both rosters pretty similar to what they were last year, so there's a lot riding on this game for Zag Nation, coming off a home loss to St. Mary's. Gonzaga is not yet on the bubble. Lenardi has them as an 8 seed, but if you don't win this game at Santa Clara, I think you're going to start to really feel the bubble strain for Mark Few and the Zags. They haven't missed the NCAA tournament since 1998, so they are very much feeling it in Spokane right now. Of note, Adama Alphabal, the best player for Santa Clara, 13 points per game, 38% from three, NBA draft prospect who came back to Santa Clara last year. He has not played since February 8th for the Broncos. It's listed as an undisclosed illness, so not sure the status there. No Alphabal would be good news for the Zags, not so good news for Herb Sendek and the Broncos. It's going to wrap it up for me today here on the Locked On College Basketball Podcast. Folks, thank you so much for making the show your first listen or your first watch of the day. I appreciate all of you. Appreciate the everyday listeners and those of you hanging out with us in the Locked On College Basketball Discord channel. Isaac and Leaf will be back with you all on Wednesday morning to recap all of the great games we just talked about and get you ready for some Wednesday night action as well. Thanks again, folks. As always, we want to say apologies to the Lawyer family. Let's go Wild Popes. And until Wednesday, peace out.